Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be analyzing one of my more recent London Chess League games. This is a 75 minutes plus 15 seconds over the board game that I played around a couple weeks ago. This game was actually a little bit special to me because I started the year with like 3 draws and one pretty brutal loss. So it also marks the first over the board victory that I've had this year. So let's get into it. I started with e4 and my opponent responded with e6, which is the French defense, and as many of you probably already know, the main move here for white is d4, and after d5, white has a bunch of different options such as knight c3, knight d2, e4, e5, e takes d5, and many others. All very solid options for white. Now, instead of going for d4, I actually went for d3 in this game, which is a bit of a sideline. And the setup that white goes for in this opening is a little bit different than what you would normally expect from a French defense game. So white is going for something like knight to d2, knight to f3, pawn to g3, bishop to g2, short castling, rook e1, e5, h4, c3, maybe d4, maybe not. And this is actually called the King's Indian attack. And you might be thinking, isn't the King's Indian an opening that black plays? And to that I would say you're almost right. So there is such a thing as the King's Indian defense, which is something that black can play against one d4. And after d4, knight f6, after something like pawn to c4 or knight to f3, black goes for g6, bishop g7, pawn d6, short castling, knight d7, and then black tries to break in the middle with e5 or c5. And this is the King's Indian defense. Now what I played is the King's Indian attack, but as you can probably notice, there are some similarities between these two setups, right? So in both setups, we have the knight on f3, we have the fianchetto, we have this particular pawn structure. Now, I guess this is called the King's Indian attack because it's white playing it and they get the extra tempo. Now, after d5, I went for knight to d2. They went c5. I went knight f3, knight c6, g3, bishop d6, bishop g2, knight e7, short castling on both sides. And here I went rook e1, and I was thinking to perhaps push e5. Rook e1 is a pretty handy move because it's flexible and it also clears out the f1 square for perhaps the knight to go there and open up the dark squared bishop. And here my opponent made a move that kind of surprised me. It wasn't very bad or anything, I just didn't think about it beforehand, which is they played f5. And as you might be able to see on the eval bar, this is, like I said, not a big mistake or anything, but it does change the evaluation from equal to somewhat better for white. And like I said, it felt a little bit strange to me during the game, but I still had to make a decision, which is, do I push or do I take? And initially I wanted to push, and I just thought this is a pretty fine, kind of typical French defense pawn structure for black. I wasn't very impressed by it, but I didn't think it was bad either. And computer agrees with me that it is slightly better for white. But after thinking for a little bit, I ended up changing my mind and I actually took on d5. And here my opponent took back with the pawn. Taking with the knight is also decent, slightly worse because black still has that pawn on e6 that is a bit of an unresolved issue, right? If the pawn just stays there, then it might become a weakness long term. So black should try to push it forwards, but that can come with its own set of problems. Plus, not having a pawn on d5 allows my knight to quickly improve itself on c4. So my opponent took with the pawn. And here I played d4. And this is an idea that I've actually seen before in a very similar pawn structure, not exactly the same line obviously, but in a similar pawn structure. And the idea behind this is that if black takes, and this looks like a free pawn, but it isn't. After knight b3, the pawn on d4 is going to be lost, basically. Black just doesn't have a way to defend it. And then the pawn on d5 is going to be isolated, right? So that's an IQP. And on top of that, black has pushed f5, which is not necessarily something that you would want to have in a position where you also have this isolated pawn on d5. Like the e6 square can become weak. The right plan for black would probably be to just push f4 at the right moment to kind of get rid of that pawn, open up the rook, open up the light squared bishop. But this is the idea that I had in mind, to play knight b3, recuperate the pawn on d4, and then play against black's isolated pawn on d5. Now, if you're wondering what is an isolated pawn, that's a fair question. So an isolated pawn is a pawn that can't be protected by another pawn, right? Not right now, not in the future. And the reason isolated pawns are sometimes weaknesses is, or are not sometimes, oftentimes weaknesses, is exactly this. They can't be protected by another pawn, which means that if the opponent starts putting pressure on an isolated pawn, you're gonna have to pretty much bring all your resources, all your pieces to defend said isolated pawn instead of, just have it protected with another pawn. Hopefully that made sense. Now in the game, my opponent went for b6, which is a very logical move. Now, before I continue, another option or another thing to consider here for both sides would be black playing c4. Maybe it looks a little bit scary to some of you because all of a sudden this pawn on c4 is in my half of the board, but that doesn't mean that the pawn on d5 is still not a weakness, right? So this pawn on c4 can't just go back and defend the pawn on d5 at some point. Plus, white can probably very quickly get rid of the c4 pawn by playing b3. And c3 is not realistic because this pawn most likely will be lost within the next few moves. So something like knight b1, bishop b4, a3 already wins the pawn for white. Now after b6, I played pawn takes c5, which was a decent move. So as you can see, I'm still doing pretty well on the eval bar. However, there was another move, the computer's best move, that I will briefly mention. I have to say I didn't even think about it, which obviously not a brag, but I'm going to show it because I think it's really pretty. The best move for white here, according to the computer, is to play c4. And the main idea behind playing c4 is to open up that g2 bishop. The second that bishop gets better control over that long diagonal, it turns into a beast, and you're actually gonna get to see this during the game as well. Now, just to give you a couple of ideas of what might happen here. So for example, if pawn takes c4, now the knight jumps in. This knight is very, very well placed. The bishop's gonna be open in no time. So for example, if I don't know, what should black play? Let's say they play bishop to b7 to kind of guard the c6 knight. Now knight bishop g5 is interesting, pinning the knight on e7. And if black doesn't pay attention here, he can end up in a losing situation very quickly. For example, let's say rook c8. Now the queen can jump in. It's threatening, for example, to take the bishop on d6 and doing a discover check. And you might be thinking, oh, but the king can just move. But white just pushes forward. Something like d5 is interesting. Very, very dynamic position for white. And obviously the knight can't take because the queen would be lost. Now, for example, if black takes on d4 instead, then we can trade. The knight comes back to b4 trying to take on d4. Pawn takes c4 is not available because the rook hangs. So let's say something like bishop to b7. Already white takes takes their pawn back, d5 is still under pressure, knight e6 is being threatened, let's say something like queen d7, the knight can jump in anyway, and then the pawn takes on d5. And this is just, you know, a couple of lines that I'm showing you. I encourage you to take this position and analyze it yourself if you'd like. It's a very, very interesting and pretty position. But getting back to the game, I took on c5. And my opponent took with the b pawn. That's why they played b6, right? And here, these two pawns, c5 and d5, are what we call hanging pawns. And hanging pawns are kind of like an isolated group of pawns, or not really sure how to give like the best definition, but basically these two pawns, they're not isolated because they're together, but they're still isolated from the rest of the structure, which means that if one of them pushes forward, the other is going to be impossible to be defended by another pawn, right? So, and the squares that are left behind, so for example in the context of d4, c4 would be a weak square for black that they can no longer take control over. Similarly, if they push c4, d4 would become a weak square that they can no longer take control over. So these two pawns, c5 and d5, can be very good in some situations because they do provide some central control, but they can also be very fragile, right? Because they are just two little pawns all by themselves, isolated from the other, you know, group of pawns. Now the computer's preferred move here is still pawn to c4 with the same idea of opening up the bishop. I missed it once, I missed it twice. To me, now it feels even less intuitive than before because you might be thinking, well, but black has d4 and now d4 is the protected passed pawn. Well, who cares, because why not just play b4 apparently, and if the knight takes, then you just have knight takes d4, discovered attack on the rook. In the game, I played a move that actually felt that was a little bit slow, and you will see the eval bar dropping a little bit. I was in between two ideas here. So on one hand, I wanted to play b3 and bishop b2, and on the other, I wanted to get this knight out of the way and go to e3. So I started with knight f1, which is a bit of a slow move. Now, my opponent, and he actually told me this during the game, said that he really didn't like me coming with the knight on e3, which is why he played d4. And this felt provocative, and as you can see, the eval bar jumped right up, and the reason for this is because black just basically helped me open up this bishop and help me get ideas of tactics that could happen on the knight on c6. So in a way, a bad move of mine actually ended up provoking my opponent into playing a bad move themselves, so that worked out. Now here I continued with knight to g5, which is a good move. It's not the best move. The best move here for white would have been c3, so the computer really wants me to open up the center and care less about my pawn structure. I'm not gonna get into this, but I encourage you to do so on your own. What I ended up playing was knight to g5, and I had a bunch of ideas behind these moves. So on one hand, open up the bishop, right? And if we stare down this diagonal hard enough, we start noticing that maybe at the right moment, a bit of a tactical pattern could occur, right? So rook takes e7 is an idea that I'm already calculating from here, now that I've opened up my bishop, because if this knight takes, the bishop takes the rook and we've won a piece. But if the bishop takes the knight and we won two minor pieces for a rook. So this is something that black already needs to be careful about. I was also thinking about maybe playing knight to e6, even though black can take me with the bishop to just kind of get the bishop there, get better control over the light squares. And the last thing that I was thinking was that maybe I can go back to h3 if nothing else works out, and then play either bishop f4 or knight f4. Now in the game, my opponent played a move that was very intuitive, but unfortunately it was the trigger for really bad things to happen to his position. So here my opponent played queen to b6. And I'm guessing that the reason they played queen b6, besides, just developing the queen, is to protect this knight on c6, right? So the bishop just opened up, the rook's trying to barge into e7. It seems like rook takes e7 doesn't work anymore because the bishop takes, and then there's no bishop takes c6 because the queen can recapture. So pretty logical move. However, as you may have already spotted from the eval bar, white is winning. But white is winning with a very specific continuation. So if you want, and I encourage you to do so, try to pause the video right now, see if you can work out the tactic for yourself, okay? Okay, so here, it seems like rook takes e7 doesn't work anymore. Because like I said, bishop takes e7 and yeah, there's no bishop takes e5, bishop takes e6 anymore. But unfortunately for black, the issue becomes less about these two pieces and more about the king. Because now that the queen is no longer on d8, bishop d5 check is now a move, right? And obviously rook f7, I can just take back the rook. So king to h8 is pretty much forced. And now you may be thinking, okay, so what? Big deal. What are you gonna play, like knight f7? No, not knight f7, because remember, we sacrificed an exchange, and this is just giving black the opportunity to give back the material that they took and actually escape and be better. So not knight f7, but knight h7. And I think during the game, my opponent was really taken by surprise by this move, because when I sacked on e7, he was very confused. And then when I went bishop d5, he was still like, okay, what's going on? And then knight takes h7, he almost had a moment of like, that's what's going on. So the knight can't be taken, right? Because queen h5 is checkmate. This bishop just does an excellent job at restricting the black king. So taking with the king is out of the question. And of course you might be thinking, yeah, but the rook just moves and now all white's done is win a pawn. Win a pawn? No. Sacrifice an exchange, then win a pawn. But that's not true, because after queen h5, it actually becomes literally impossible for black to stop the checkmate. So, of course, in this position, there's like a bunch of checkmate threats. But the really nice part is that if the rook takes on d5, now you might be thinking, well, the square on g8 is no longer guarded. No, it isn't, but with knight f6, it is. And this is just checkmate. So rook d8 is not an option, and neither is something like queen to d8 to try to now take here or take here, because the very least that I can do is just take the knight, right? Take the knight, this rook's still hanging, this rook's hanging, and I'm not even behind in material at the moment. So clearly I'm not going to be once I take one of the two rooks, whichever black decides to give up. So spotting queen to h5 after knight takes h7, my opponent continued with g6. And here, of course, I thought I can take back the rook and I take back my exchange and I'm going to be a pawn up, and the black king is still weak, so surely I'm fine. But then I got a sneakier idea, and I was actually really happy with this during the game. So since they played g6, because queen h5 was so good that it just needed to be stopped at any cost, I thought, what about queen d2? Because now that they played g6, the queen's jumping into h6, and it's the same idea as before, the same unescapable checkmate. So if black once again tries something like rook d8, targeting the bishop, queen h6. There's just no way of escaping a discovered check and checkmate from this point onwards. Now, in the game, black played knight e5, which it just looks so funny, right? Because now literally both black rooks can be taken. And I'm thinking that black maybe was hoping for some sneaky ideas after knight takes f8, bishop takes f8, which is what happened in the game. After bishop takes a8, bishop b7, all of a sudden there is this knight f3 check and queen threat, and I don't really have a way to get my bishop out of there, so I have to trade. And now knight f3 is just unstoppable, and it looks scary, right? So maybe from a distance, my opponent had like one last hope of maybe catching me with this. The problem is that it doesn't really work. So even though it looks scary, after moving the queen out of here to, you know, no longer be part of the knight's scope, after knight f3, it is very, very important not to go king to g2. King to g2 is the only way you can lose in this game, because you're basically inviting black to start looking for double checks. And after something like knight e1, if you go back to g1, then queen g2 is game over. Very painful game over. I would hate to lose like this. And if you go king to h3, then black's probably still winning with something like queen g2, king h4, and now, I don't know, at least knight f3, and the queen has to sacrifice herself. And then, I mean, white still has like a rook and a bishop for the queen, but the white king is still really, really poorly placed, so black is just completely winning. In fact, the engine is telling me that it's checkmate in 13 moves from here. But if instead of falling for king g2, you go king h1, everything is fine, because there just aren't any good checks for black to go for. So if knight h4, trying to go for the same idea of queen g2 checkmate, now we go f3. If they take with the queen, well, we trade queens and we're very happy. If they take with the knight, now, you know, just a move. And the point is, on one hand, the queen's guarding the g2 square, but also if black tries to do some sort of perpetual, so check and back here, now the king can just escape via f2. So it makes a big difference that white has the opportunity to give up the f3 pawn, whereas in the other variation it was double check, so the king had to move. But this has not happened during the game. So after I took the rook on f8 and they took back with the bishop, I decided to delay for a little bit, taking the rook on a8, and instead of having to, you know, worry myself or, I don't know, risk accidentally blundering what I've just shown you, I went for queen f4. And queen f4 threatens the knight on e5. If the knight moves somewhere, then at least I can take the rook on a8. But it's actually worse than that, because queen f4 is threatening check here, and then after the king moves, something like bishop h6 is devastating. It's probably checkmate actually within the next move. Like the king goes back to h8, the bishop takes on f8, and that's it. So yeah, this was a really tough moment for black. Now I think my opponent here went for bishop g7, which is unfortunately walking straight into checkmate. But like I said, there just wasn't anything else. So even something like knight c6, like I said, leads into queen h4, or what happened in the game, bishop g7, queen h4, and after bishop h6, queen takes h6 is checkmate. My opponent resigned after queen h4 check. So yeah, short and sweet game. I really liked it. Obviously, I got a bit lucky because the game could have been so much more complicated and so much longer if my opponent hadn't allowed the rook takes e7 tactic. But I still thought that it was very pretty and quite instructive as well. But yeah, if you like the game, you can let me know in the comments. You can ask me questions. Do consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you for the next analysis. Thank you.